Hello. Today we're going to talk about the three sectors of, public, private, and nonprofit, and we're going to compare them in terms of their organization, administration, and finance. This lecture is based on several chapters of Leisure Services Financial Management. Previously, when this course was fourth year of Financial Management and Recreation course, I used this textbook, but I always found it a bit repetitive. So this lecture is a mishmash of all of different parts of these chapters. So we've already talked about the private sector. We learned about that in HQR 2100 about the three sectors. And, examples include like Walnuts Climbing Center, Outfitters, O'Brien's, like boating, the Little Gym. I think this is actually a yoga company that might not exist anymore. And then Cast On, Cast Off. I'm not sure if it exists either still, but it was a wool supplies, like for yarn, for knitting. You get like sea kayaking. And in fact, people who run many of these organizations, some of them are graduates of the School of Human Kinetics and Recreation. So how does the private sector operate? Well, in the private sector, it's really the customer difference. Businesses obviously rely on value transaction with customers, whether that transaction, that value transaction is a good or a service. There's obviously money is exchanged, and in some way it hopefully has to meet the customer's needs, or they wouldn't be purchasing it. The customers have a choice of whether to purchase. And also, in the private sector, businesses generally don't have a target market of people who are in low income. That's more what governments and not-for-profits focus on. The text kind of focuses a lot on greed as a motivator, and like that greed motivates entrepreneurs to serve customers, to be more efficient, and to be more effective. And I have to say I disagree with that, and I actually took that out as a slide because I kind of feel that, obviously, when you're trying to make money and make profit in order to, have an income, you're going to try to be as efficient as you can. And I know, obviously, there is greed in the world, a lot of it, but I think that for a lot of entrepreneurs, especially in our sector, like in recreation, leisure, sport, physical education, etc., education, it's really about like helping people and also like sharing our knowledge or, teaching. And the book also points out the various ways in which government could be more like business, but ultimately says that they can't. And I kind of feel the author left out what I mean when I say government should be more like business. Like, I think the government needs to be smarter with how they spend money, and also that they could have a few little perks or serve customer needs better if they use their money more wisely. So, entrepreneurs begin businesses without knowing if there are customer needs to be met. These entrepreneurs then believe such needs exist, but they aren't sure until they introduce the program, service, or good. So starting a new business venture is riskier than buying an existing business. But once a need is seen, then you develop the service and develop promotional techniques for educating potential customers, to become customers. So most business ventures really begin then with the belief in this. You do your market research, and then you're obviously you're trying to start a business because you believe that the product or service is what will meet people's needs. This is from G.E. Mills. He's actually a noted Canadian business environmentalist. I found that out. Anyway, he says that 73% from the entrepreneur's previous experience with different business. Sorry, pardon me. These are like how business ideas originate. So 73% was from prior experience. So that's kind of saying like most people, you have to have a business to start a business, I guess. You're more likely, obviously. 33% of new business or business ideas come from business associates. 26% was from experiences with similar businesses. And 19% was from friends and relatives. And the thing that I kind of found the missing here, like about like personal experience, like I think probably in our field, it might be like you're trying to seek a service, or like one of your family members is, and you realize that like you can't find it, so obviously others. So I think that's one way of developing an idea for a business. So you can be a sole proprietor. So that's the definition, is the only owner of a business. My dad was a sole proprietor of a company. He left a large corporation, I think, when I was about 13. And if some of you may have family members who are business owners, and sometimes at the beginning, obviously, it was I'm not even going to explain what the business was. It doesn't matter. But it was something that he knew would be successful. But, sometimes like clients take a while to pay you back. I can remember times when, my dad didn't have money to really pay like his salary. He would want to pay the staff, but he had to wait to pay himself. Long hours, you're always on call for many hours, like many times, especially when he was starting off for the first 10 years or so. He was on all of our vacations. He always was on his computer, at least in the morning, and then he would turn it off. But for the first hours, he also was an earlier riser. So, it's a lot of work being a sole business owner. There's a lot of risk until things kind of get going. Now as an example, my dad's business ended up being doing quite well, and he ended up with expanding it and had probably 7 employees maybe at the end, or maybe it was 3, 4, and then someone bought him out, and he was bought his company, and he was able to work there for a couple of years in the transition period, and retired. People obviously then look at market research options, and there's various ways to find out what people want. Market research is one of those ways. The probability of success is higher when decisions are based on data rather than feelings or stories. Although I'm not sure if I totally agree with that, because that's kind of saying that qualitative is not as good as quantitative in a way. But although data can be misleading, market research can identify customer needs in a way that shows what products or services customers would purchase. So you usually first offer the product or service in a test market. For example, let's say you want to start a camp. Well, you're not going to start a children's camp, like purchase the land, build this whole thing, go into all this debt, build a structure, and then, decide to offer your camp. You might go and, run a camp as best you can from facilities that you can rent. Or, some camps actually allow you, that's one way they make money, is they will rent out the camp space to someone else during times when they're not using the facilities. Although I don't see that maybe as often, but I've heard of it. You can also perform feasibility analysis, like from focus groups, surveys, and customer interviews. Market research could be like giving out surveys, seeking feedback and to see if the product or service was worth purchasing. I don't know if you've done any of these. Like, for example, I have, I'm an Air Miles Gold member, and that means that I get to do the surveys. And I have done a lot of market research surveys to get Air Miles points, because I started this when I was I started doing these sorts of things when I was doing my PhD. Anyway, so it's been a long time. So, that's one way of doing it. And so you can hire companies like that in order to do these types of surveys for you. Although you can also just do it yourself. But you can also do what is like create pro bono calculations that estimate the needed revenues to cover expenses. And this is what's called a feasibility analysis. And that's something I'm not exactly sure what exactly that all means. It's beyond my knowledge, but I do know that it should be unbiased. And so it's actually best if you hire someone if you actually had the money. But although sometimes, sometimes market research is a bit superficial. As I said, like I've done a lot, and I'm not sure that it never actually truly taps into what I want or think. For example, I always think with environmental values when I purchase products or services, and that's never like something that they ever ask me about. Yet I kind of feel like that's something that a lot of other people care about now. It seems like it's they're often very like I don't know, very market research driven, like not thinking about values, just thinking about what you purchase and what you know about things. Very for consumerist people. You can also look at existing business ventures. So you have to like understand what is your competitors. So you have to stay in business, you must defend against, competition once you have a business going on. And the most competitive in growth, maturation, and declining stages. So in a company, you've got, your introduction, you've got saturation, then it goes growth, maturation, and then decline. So this is saying that competition is greatest during the stages of growth, maturation, and decline. And so how do you stay in business and make sure that you're competitive? Well, it's about focusing on how to better meet customer needs and also retaining existing customers. And I guess, it's also about taking away potential customers, so that they don't go over to the competition. Obviously, in a company, you want to be making a profit. So this starts with a budget that shows a profit is possible. You need to not just think you need to be pretty sure you're going to be able to make profit. Making profit also means that your annual income statement shows that your revenues, the things that you take in, have exceeded your expenses, the things that go out, obviously. And it also, you make a profit when equity on the balance sheet grows. So as the value of your company is increasing. So you also need to then understand what's the difference between debt versus equity. So we know that equity then is not something that has to be repaid. It's the worth. Equity holders are paid when the company makes profit, like when like in shares or like dividends. Whereas obviously debt needs to be repaid, and debtors are paid a defined percentage of interest. So that could be like a loan or anything else like that. So debt plus equity then equals the total assets of the company. Liabilities then include accounts payable and long and short-term debt. And the assets then are what the company owns. Debt is what it owes to someone else. And in the end, then, equity is the remaining value of the company. So to get a business venture up and running, you need to get capital needs must be acquired. So this is like to cover operations. So capital needs are the money that you need to get a business started, to cover operating costs. You need to assemble enough capital to cover these costs. So, and how can you do this? Well, it could be personal resources or borrowing money. Oh, pardon me. So when you get a loan, you have left to look at the interest. The interest then is the money paid regularly at a particular rate for the use that you have borrowed this money, and also there's also a regular rate for delaying the repayment of a debt. So obviously you want to be, when you're starting a company, you want to be finding loans then that have low interest rates. And there are, many banks, and there's even government programs, that offer these sorts of loans to help with, startup money. Other people, like, for example, might use a line of credit. But obviously then you're wanting to make sure that you're getting the lowest interest rate you can possible. And principal is the word for the original amount borrowed or invested by the lender. So for example, if I borrowed $5,000, then that's the principal of my loan. And then obviously that principal will acquire interest depending on how long it takes me to repay it. So when you're starting a company, you really then have two options for trying to get these capital costs. You have sale of debt or you have sale of equity. So sale of debt means that you're financing a business with a bank loan and that you have to pay it back with interest. Alternatively, you could look for sale of equity, and that is financing a business with co-owners or partners. So, like venture capitalists. So, how do you borrow money? Well, you can go to the bank, but sometimes banks are not always, especially if you're someone who's just starting a business, it's your first time, they might view your business venture as risky and not a good investment. A lot of people use family and friends or personal resources. They might, for example, you hear about, people who've helped to finance, their siblings' restaurant or something like that. And the capital and startup costs are usually funded by the owner or the owner's family through equity contributions. Another way is through venture capitalists. So think of like Dragon's Den. These are investors who are willing to take risks that banks and other lending institutions aren't willing to take. It can be the original owners of the company or people who just want to own stock in a company or equity. They're often people who just want to make a quick profit if the value of the stock goes up. And there's people who, make a business of this. Now, I'm not so sure that in our lives, many of us are going to be starting businesses in recreation and leisure studies or therapeutic recreation, where we're going to have venture capitalists knocking on our door. But you should understand that that is how businesses can get started. You can also, if you're an existing company, you can also borrow money. So how does an existing company borrow money? Well, it can borrow from the bank. So they might borrow money to leverage assets, using the value of their business assets to acquire more land or more buildings or equipment. If the company's doing well, meaning it has high equity, then interest will be low. If the company is struggling, the interest rate for the debt is going to be higher. I've already talked about, selling. You can also sell stock, to venture capitalists, for example. People also can issue corporate bonds. So this is existing companies that don't want to borrow money from banks or sell stocks. They issue these. They sell corporate bonds generally to private investors rather than lending institutions. So in a startup company, usually debt is typically loans from a bank. In existing company, debt is usually long-term or short-term bonds. And it can expand when companies desire to leverage their assets to increase their sales. In terms of equity, in a startup company, equity is often provided by, venture capitalists. In an existing company, or family and friends, in an existing company, equity is the difference between assets and liabilities. And the equity of a company can be expanded when new stock in the company is sold to new investors. So you can make your company public and have it have stock, sell stock. Stock are the equities or certificates of ownership of a company. So recall that equity can be expanded when new stock in a company is sold to new investors. So new owners purchase a share of the equity from the current owners. And so corporate stock, which is kind of like equity in the company, it's actually bought and sold at a market price. And the value of the corporate stock is traded on the stock market. I've had friends who have worked at the Toronto Stock Exchange. Pretty crazy job. And so the value, what determines the price of the stock, though, of a company? Well, it's the revenue the company is expected to acquire in the future. It's the state of the company. It's about new products in the works and confidence in the management of the company. And I did not include this here, but I would definitely say politics as well. So there's two types of companies then. There's publicly held companies and private companies. Publicly held then are companies that sell stock to investors on the stock market. They have to show their financial statements to both stockholders and potential stockholders. So they do have some transparency that they have to provide. Whereas a private company, especially if it's got like a sole proprietor or equity owners, they're not obliged by law to show any financial reports to anyone other than the owners. Okay. So there's not as much transparency. So you do have, though, to look at stockholders. The advantage of selling stock is that there's no principal or interest payments to strain the budget. But the disadvantage is that new investors share ownership. Stockholders have a legal right to have a say in how the company operates. They own a share of the company. They have voting rights in management decisions. They might expect a return in their investment, and they obviously expect the value of their stock to increase over time. And, we've all seen movies of, when there is like a takeover and it's always because someone has bought so much stock and now they have 41%. And, that's the basis of also, a lot of dramas as well, TV dramas. So when your company is public, and sell stock, you have to have a board of directors. And these are usually elected by the stockholders. They typically the stockholders themselves who own a large number of shares. Sometimes they're people who are put on the board for symbolic purposes. And they can also be people who serve on multiple boards of directors. And obviously, we're talking about large companies here, not small ones. But, obviously the board of directors can get very political. It's very political, for example, in the States. There's a term called interlocking directorates. And these are when you have corporate board members who either serve on other boards or who are managers of other corporations in various industries. So, it's like you have someone who is on a board in one type of industry and then on a second industry, or this could be someone who is a manager in a different industry. So it's like having industry representation on your board. Now, obviously, the politics of business, the politics do influence business. Wherever there are people, there are politics, and business is no different. Now, this is particularly, though, when it comes to large public or private organizations and ones that, that are publicly held and have, stock holders. So people are elected to boards by stockholders and other board members. So there's politics there and power. There are power struggles on the board for control of management decisions, and also power struggles on the board to determine who is going to be managers. So there's a lot of politics that can go on, especially, as I said, in large corporations. This would be especially, for example, think of in sports. In professional sports, there's a lot of politics there. So the not-for-profit sector is obviously may seem like the opposite end of the private sector, because obviously the mission in the private sector is to make profit. Where with the not-for-profit sector, obviously they cannot make profit by definition. But they're still also different from government, because nonprofit leisure service organizations usually have a different mission than government units while offering the same type of leisure services. The nonprofit sector in North America is really quite substantial in terms of the number of organizations, its economic activity, and also the individuals involved. A Canadian survey, which actually is fairly dated, really, that I found, it indicated that the sector reports totaling $122 billion annually. So these numbers really translate to large economic benefits when looking at the direct jobs as part of the overall economy. And, there's a lot of people who are employed in the not-for-profit sector. And then there's also volunteers, which obviously is slightly different, but there's usually about 6 million volunteers working in non-for-profit and volunteer organizations in Canada. So what is a nonprofit? It's important for you to be able to define a nonprofit. It's not just about not making profit. There are different types of nonprofit organizations, including those that operate for public benefit, those that operate for benefit of members only, religious organization, and educational organizations. You need to also understand that there's a difference between nonprofits and charities. A nonprofit is usually it's a social or recreational or hobby group, like curling club, golf club, swimming club. It could be around certain amateur sports organizations, like hockey associations, baseball leagues. All those are nonprofits usually. Certain festival organizations, for example, like the St. John's Folk Festival, is a nonprofit organization. In contrast, a charity is relief of poverty, usually, like food banks, soup kitchens, and low-cost housing units. It can be for the advancement of education or advancement of religion, or for the purpose of beneficial to the community, like animal shelters, libraries, etc. So charities, when you donate, you can give money to a not-for-profit and you can give money to a charity. But a charity is when you can actually get like a receipt back. You have to have a charity number, where nonprofits, they're just like fundraising. So nonprofit organizations then have, obviously, they provide a service to its members or to the public. If they obviously have no owner or stockholder who profit from its excessive revenue. And if they do have profits received, these activities have to be put back into the organization to, further its purpose. And in contrast, you have a charity. It's established and operates exclusively for charitable purposes, and it has to be registered with the Canadian Revenue Agency. And you get an approved registration as a charity with the registration number, where not-for-profits are registered as incorporated as non-for-profits, and that is at the provincial level. So charity is Canadian level, federal level. Nonprofit is provincial level. So why do organizations incorporate? Why do you want to become a nonprofit? Well, you have to have a formal structure under which to operate, which is good. It helps. You can also then hold title to land. You can qualify for grants or funding. You can also apply for a lottery license. And it's also about limiting personal liability of members. There are, though, many challenges facing nonprofit organizations. So there is a lot of paperwork sometimes involved in not-for-profit, or it feels like bureaucracy. You have to apply for not-for-profit status, set up all the legal aspects. If you've taken community development with me or some of my other courses, you know that I used to run a not-for-profit, and that you have to make sure that you're, for example, announcing your annual general meeting, etc. All this sorts of thing. Making and obviously with grants and all that, there's a lot of paperwork involved there as well. Financial reporting that you have to do. You obviously also have to keep track of treasury statements and make sure that you know what's in the accounts and etc. Community support can be a challenge, but it's also a rewarding part of not-for-profit work. Relationship building is really essential, and also marketing, because marketing is important not just to people who are your potential participants or customers, clients, but it's also about partners and people who are going to help, whether it's in kind or partnerships or resources, etc. So websites and newsletters, social media, news releases, all this, having a catchy slogan. And a lot of the time, we are actually not very good at doing that, especially in not-for-profit. And why is that? Because you usually don't have, in large organizations, they might have a whole staff person to do that, or a whole department. Like think of, Canadian Cancer Society. But, McMorrin Community Center doesn't have a, marketing or social media person. It's just someone whose job is doing it. And, often, there's someone who does the newsletters, but it's not like the social media aspect might be as paid attention to. There's obviously a lot of accounting. You have to keep records and file reports with provincial and sometimes federal, depending. You need basic bookkeeping skills. You might have to hire an accountant. And there's compliance that you have to do. Like you have to file required reports. And how complex these reportings are depends on how large the organization is. My little not-for-profit, the Community Garden Alliance, which actually I've found out has been revived, but under new directorship. And that it's a small organization, and so there wasn't a lot of reports that had to be done. Obviously, fundraising is a big challenge with non-for-profits. And in fundraising, communication and storytelling are essential. You have to solicit donations. You might be like selling products or concessions, thinking of Girl Guide cookies or the daffodils when it's for the Canadian Cancer Society. And large corporate sponsors you might actually have in exchange for advertising rights. And you see that, a lot in the States, but you see it more and more, I would say, in Canada as well. Look at YMCA. It's a not-for-profit. I was, there's names plastered all over the place of corporate sponsors in that building. And, it doesn't look like the Y that I grew up with. Another challenge is obviously generating revenue, and that might be grants or donations from foundations or the government in order to have government expenses, and charging membership or user fees. So membership might be a big part of not-for-profits. You also might be charging admission to events. So in not-for-profits, they need to generate revenue in some way, and this is called a revenue engine. So a revenue engine is a very profitable service where the fee structures for the program generate substantially more in revenue than the program costs to provide. So meaning it makes profit. It's when you have a program or service in a not-for-profit that you are not going to subsidize at all, and you're going to make profit, and then that revenue goes into covering the costs of the other programs and services. So there can be revenue engines as primary sources of income. So this is charging fees, as I said, at making profit. You do this then on programs that are expected to be profitable using private sector pricing. There are some programs where people are willing to pay substantially more. For example, daycare programs, after-school programs, birthday parties. Usually like fitness membership, camp programs are other example. Any type of like instructional class. And as an example, like I went to a there was a parent taught or like parent taught program. I can't remember the actual title. Anyway, that was run at the Virginia Park Community Center. And I and my husband, but it was me a lot at the time, we would go a lot to the Virginia Park for this program. And it was held Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And it was from, I can't remember if it was 9:30 to 11:30 or 9 to 11. So 2 hours. So that's 6 hours. And at the program, it was, there would usually be a craft, there would be a snack provided, and then also it was just opportunity for the children to play together and for the, parents to gab. Most of the time, it was a lot of nans that took their grandkids, but anyway, I quite enjoyed going. And, and I got a coffee and a chat and got out of the house when I had babies, and especially when I had a 2-year-old and, an infant. So that was free. That program was free. I would have been very willing to have paid for the program. And when I looked there, it wasn't. Now, some people were people who maybe were low income families and lived in the community, but a lot of the people that went to the program were just lived in sort of that area of town, and some were even people who were nannies who brought their children. Anyway, they could have had a different fee structure for the people who could pay. Instead, they made it for free. I would have been way happy to have paid a bit, at least to cover some of the costs, but I think they could have made profit on that. You can also then get a revenue engine from a membership model. So this is where people pay to join the agency and pay no additional fees, for using certain services. And you think of, the YMCA is a good example. Or another example is a country club uses a membership model. My parents belonged to one. You have an annual fee to be a member. Or a tennis club is another thought. So in the membership model, there's sometimes an upfront initiation fee, like the one-time cost to join. This is often used, especially if it's like a country club or that sort of thing. But in places like, YMCA, often if it's like low-income people that are accepted or, are part of the not-for-profit, or that's the mandate, then that is waived, or they don't even do that. But there could be an annual membership fee. Again, you can also waive that. If you do have a membership model, you can waive that, depending partially or totally waived. And there can also be then like some programs that have additional program fees. So, maybe there's like a base membership and it goes up. So the membership model then provides the revenue engine to sustain the operating costs. And then in that case, you're competing directly with the private sector. And think of like fitness centers, like the YMCA is a not-for-profit. Well, so is the Works. They're competing directly with places like Good Life Fitness. The fees for programs that are not revenue engines then cover direct costs. So you would rarely contribute as much revenue as membership fees. So you do have to manage members, though, and in a large not-for-profits like the YMCA, there's probably like a person in charge of just like membership. Director of memberships or something like that. And, it's cheaper and easier to keep an existing member than to find a new one. So yeah, they're the membership director. They're really then about building relationships with members. They're doing customer relations, evaluations, and like surveys, satisfaction. They're staying in regular contact. And they also might provide like discounts and special programs or personal services for members. And part of the membership model, though, is you also have to look for new members. So that's advertising the programs, incentives to existing members to bring their friends, discounts or initiation fee waivers, that sort of thing. Another large part of not-for-profits are donations and grants. And you're seeking donations and grants to defray operating costs if you're unable to establish revenue engines. And often then this is through government funds. In Canada, it's common for not-for-profits to receive provincial and municipal funds. Then there's also fundraising and donations. So fundraising is the process of soliciting and gathering monetary contributions or donations to other resources by nonprofit or governmental agencies. And so it doesn't have to be money. It can be other types of like donations or any type of resource, right? It could be a building, it could be equipment, lots of things. It could be time. Even, for example, an accountant who wants to volunteer their time, their service, waive their fee to do your accounting or that sort of thing. I remember my mom had a book and I read it when I was a teenager. It was called "Let's Put the Fun in Fundraising." Anyway, it was great. I still remember it. Anyway, often there are, like in large not-for-profits, they are looking at fundraising consultants, and they're brought in to reassure the board that, it's, what's going on, and to make sure that, like, especially if staff are new or not really sure about fundraising. And it might seem like it costs a lot of money, but sometimes it's actually effective because it helps to improve your fundraising at first. And then you can, it's just a consultant. You don't have to keep them forever. There are two types of fundraising then. There's primary fundraising and secondary fundraising. Primary fundraising is usually campaigns that are run right by the organization itself, and that's to cover operating or capital costs. Secondary fundraising is typically for operating cost support. And this might be, again, this is for really large not-for-profits. This is when they're doing campaigns. So it's not like the organization itself isn't running the campaign. It's an external organization, like the United Way. So obviously, the ultimate goal is to provide security for the future when you're doing primary fundraising, because it's dealing with operating expenses. So this could be like annual fundraising events that you might do, capital campaigns to defray capital costs like land, building, and equipment, or building an endowment fund. What is an endowment fund, you may ask? Well, it's groups of investments that provide a steady stream of dividends to the not-for-profit. It helps to, smooth out the effects of like rise and fall of donations or in the economy. And, it can also help with, it could be just used for generating income, or it could be used for things like scholarships or capital costs projects. So an endowment fund is set up when it's usually like someone who has money contributes, or could be a bunch of people who have large chunks of money. They donate this large chunk to an endowment fund, and it goes into a bank, and that amount of money makes some interest every year. Well, that interest then is used to help with, other costs, or it could be restricted. So, for example, at mine, we have endowment funds for scholarships, and they often are named after certain people, and that's like, for example, a family. Often people, like someone who died or in memory of someone, they've set up a fund, a scholarship. They donated a whole chunk of money up front, and then the interest, is then used to fund the scholarship. So, as I said, capital campaigns happen. Now, this does not happen as much in our field. However, it is common in healthcare. Like if capital campaigns happen, for example, at at the hospital, you usually have large versus small donors. So a large donor would be giving 25 to 50%, and where secondary next level would be 10 to 25. And large donors usually have naming rights, and this is actually more common in the U.S. It's more political there. But as I've aged, even at the university level, names used to be buildings used to be named after educators or researchers, or historical people, and now they're named after organizations, corporations, even on campus. But you see that especially in the States. I've noticed that, like at the University of Waterloo, where I went to, we used to be engineering 1, engineering 2, math, all just boring names. And now it's all donors' names. And the hard part too is, like, think of the Bruno Center building. It used to be called the Inco building, and I think it had a name before that. So the name can change because of the large donor changes. Small donors are obviously like more like, it can be like $25 to $1,000. But you still need these small donors. But you have to have, they often want to see large donors give too. So donor cultivation then is important in fundraising, again, in not-for-profit. Donor cultivation is the term that's used in fundraising to describe the relationship building part that is important. And you have to look at your donor base. The donor base is the group of people within a committee who are regular contributors to your community charities and not-for-profit organizations. So this is like all about making friends with the donors. Donors give to their friends, not to organizations. Or there's the rule of 10. Be patient in relationship building. Don't ask for a donation until at least the 10th meeting with potential donor. I'm going to end the lecture here for now, and we'll further discuss about donations in the next lecture. I just feel that this is getting a little long of a video, and it's a topic that is probably not the most fun to have to sit through and listen. So I'm going to end it here, and we'll do part 2 of this lecture.